group of world-renowned designers to think about what would happen In the past 2 months, I've had the rare pleasure to spend a couple of days with Madi in his Martian and Batesley Asian garden, and I thank him very much for allowing me to observe his creative process. It's been a real pleasure. So, Sandra?
Well, we've got a series of really exciting programs coming up this year, and it's all as a result of the input that you all gave last April when we did the survey. And here to kick off our season is one of the world's leading authorities on both tropical design and the cultures of Southeast Asia. Designer and author Madi Wijaya has been delighting us with his books and gardens for the past 30 years. He's best known for his romantic Balinese garden designs and for his books and films on the architecture and the culture of Bali. His resort gardens are particularly famous, beginning with his first at the legendary Bali Wijaya. Here in Naples, he is the designer, as you know, of the Asian garden at the Naples Botanical Garden that is opening this week. Born Michael White in Sydney, Australia, he arrived in Bali in 1973, having jumped ship and swam ashore in a rainstorm. Oh, just wait, there's more. A student of architecture, he first of all intended the visit as a short break from his studies, but his fascination with Bali's rich culture and tradition led him to move in with a Brahmin family in South Bali. After various jobs teaching tennis, English, working as a tourist guide and photojournalist, he began contributing to guidebooks before being asked to design the gardens of the legendary Bali Wijaya. More than 600 gardens later, Madi is a world-renowned tropical garden designer whose company, PT Wijaya Tribhuwana International, has a 500-strong team of artisans and garden commandos, as he calls them. He's written only 8 books on architecture and landscape design, including Tropical Garden Design, which has sold over 100,000 copies, Modern Tropical Garden Design, and The Best of Stranger in Paradise, The Diary of an Expatriate in Bali. His most recent residential project was featured in the August 2010 issue of Architectural Digest, and I want to tell you, it was fabulous. So today his presentation, which he calls The Romantic Charm Landscape Design Movement, an antidote to post-Zen depression. He told me that it's bland minimalism is the fashion in urban house design. And in the tropical world, this fad has swept into the garden too. So his lecture is a hitchhiker's guide back to artful naturalism. Please join me in welcoming our renowned guest, Madi Wijaya.
Is that on, Larry? Hello, testing. And if we could leave the lights on just for 5 minutes while I do an introduction. I didn't know who Liz was when she first appeared at the Gardens last visit, and there was very polite, not a pushover, but a very polite lady, taking lots of notes, and I was amazed to find out what a powerhouse she is. And I'm not surprised to learn that she's now in charge of the crowd control. And we talked about this on the way to the we talked about this on the way to the venue today, and I said, "Well, crowd control. What are you looking at? Like men kissing each other in front of the Holy Father or something, like a flash mob?" Now this cheeky little minx then said, "More like a hot flush mob," she said. But I had an epiphany at 4 a.m. in the morning, because I've given this lecture quite a bit, and I just think it's important that you pitch the direction, the style of the lecture to one's audience, and this being a very American audience, I wrote that when one looks at the beautiful gardens of Connecticut, one thinks of England, and the fabulous artful, natural landscape traditions of the 17th and 18th century in particular. When one looks at the Spanish and mission gardens of Santa Barbara and Montecito and even Los Angeles, one thinks of the Andalusian Moorish influences descended from the ancient gardens of Persia and perhaps even ancient Egypt. Many of the suburban gardens of Seattle bring to mind the great Japanese garden traditions. But it's in the tropical gardens in America, the Balinese gardens in the shopping malls, the exuberant English parkland hotel gardens of Hawaii, and the cutting-edge New Asia gardens of the smart new tropical hotels in Miami and the Caribbean, that one only has a sort of murky or sort of mysterious idea of the provenance. I hope that this lecture today on the evolution of the Southeast Asian garden, and the themes as mentioned by Sondra, will educate you about the background of the Balinese garden, and then you will go and hopefully see the garden I've created with the wonderful team at the Naples Botanical Garden, and you'll understand it more. I've got to direct it at the computer. Oh, go back one. Now this is possibly I've traveled a lot around Southeast Asia. I was a guide on a marine tourism vessel, and we stopped at all the beautiful islands of eastern Indonesia. And the people of the Pacific, the Polynesians, don't really realize that they are from Indonesia originally. The ancient Indonesians, if you want to know what an ancient Indonesian garden looks like, you really just need to go to, say, sort of Hawaii or to Fiji, or into the eastern extremes of Indonesia near East Timor. And this extraordinary temple of the seven winds, each one of these big stones represents one of the wind directions, and those incredible trees that are shaped like clouds, is sort of the most ancient of Indonesian gardens. There's no idea of architecture or form. It's just a place of worship, a ceremonial ground. But it is a primeval Asian garden. People tend to think of Asian gardens as being like Rousseau, very luxuriant, verdant, fecund. But in fact, the real Asian garden, tropical or otherwise, is something quite Spartan. Now, I went to Hawaii, to the place where my ancestor, Captain Cook, murdered a few natives and destroyed most of the local culture. There is a wonderful place there called the City of Refuge, which is the Hawaiians' own Alcatraz. And it survives today as a series of walls, of basalt, I think lava stone walls. And it brings the idea of landscape architecture into the fore. Now, one imagines that the very ancient Indonesian gardens also had these walled compounds to protect from the wildebeest and the tsunamis and et cetera, but really it's only in the Pacific that one finds these. There's a famous submerged one, I think, in Tonga. But the idea of these walls is terribly important. There's one out near Rattlesnake Hammock, and the entrance to a large complex I saw. The Terrace Sanctuary is another staple of the ancient Asian garden. This is a village in Flores, which means flower. The Portuguese came to East Indonesia, Francis Xavier, introducing Catholicism and basketball at the same time. And most of these traditional villages were raised, but quite a few survived. And here we see the example of the raised chompangs that you find in the middle of Asian villages, tropical Asian villages. We're really confining this garden and the lecture to tropical Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. So really, even in Nepal and Northeast India and down through Burma and right through Java and Sumatra and East Indonesia, Vietnam, the ancient villages all have this idea of the tree of life on the platform. And the platform was where the chieftains would sit and have powwows, where they'd park important, I think dolmens they're called, someone correct me if it's a manir, which commemorates an important feast or a death or a coronation. Now the Chinese, the South Chinese, and the Indonesian people swept down from Yunnan in South China. Their landscape traditions were more architectural, they were more sculptural, they were more sophisticated. And they had these wonderful tea gardens, and this is in the Erhai Lake near Dali in Yunnan, which is the plateau of the Eternal Spring. And as you can see, it's already quite ornate, quite structured, the idea of tables and chairs, balustrades. And at the Asian garden, I've done a sort of a bit of a nod to that in what I call the Vietnam patio. In Sumatra, you have the arrival of the pavilion and the longhouse. So the idea of the chieftain sitting on the pile of rocks or the raised platform was then converted into a longhouse. The roof, a shade structure, was built over the chompang. To me, the platforms are everything. The roof is just a temporary structure, as it was for the Mayans. If you look at all of the Mayan ruins, you've got to just try and imagine timber structures like this on them. And each of those posts belongs to sort of like a clan chief of the Sumatrans, who are rather like the Scottish and also very, very braveheart. On the other side of that longhouse, which the thatch is from the sugar palm, which was confiscated by your delightful customs authorities, and it is from a tree that grows taller than the coconut, so it's used for temples. It's always that animistic thing about the link between nature. It's not just worshipping nature, it's the way you look at nature and access nature. And I tried to use that in the garden design in Naples. So because they're chieftains, they're allowed they and only they are allowed to use the black ejuk, thatch. On the other side is a giant body of water, probably from the South Indian tradition of tanks, which is a very important introduction, as the tradition of the Persian garden with its rills and its cascades was carried into northern Africa and up into southern Europe, Spain in particular, Andalusia, the wonderful Alhambra, eventually up and influencing the Dutch water garden specialist, Le Notre, over to Connecticut, you know. There was a direction the other way too. So from Persia it went up into Central Asia, to Isfahan, over to Mughal India. The most famous one that survives is in Shalimar. The famous Guerlain perfume is named after that famous scented garden, perfume garden. And then down into Cambodia, which is particularly famous, Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, the city, which was at its time the biggest city in the world, had vast tanks and floating pavilions on them. This is the inspiration for the Chandi ruin, the ruinscape I've done in Naples. But this is the sort of the terrace sanctuary after a layer of classical Hindu decorative art is laid over it. This was the last temple built during the Hindu era before the arrival of Islam in Java. The Majapahit king Wijaya went up into the hills near Solo, central Java, where Gunung Merapi is exploding at the moment. Marapai, as the Fox News calls it. And achieved moksha at this temple, oneness with the Godhead. He was a holy king. And as Islam had swept into his father's court, and there was a lot of duplicity. But anyway, there's a whole story behind this Chandi, so I chose that. It looks a bit Mayan. You can see that it's sort of descended from the ancient Asian gardens. And the great archaeologist Bernard Kempfer said that in this temple, and only in this temple, did the king return to the aboriginal motifs of Java. And you can say the same about the aboriginal motifs of, say, Vietnam without Chinese influence. South Korea has the same thing. The crouched figures, the Venuses, fertility symbols. The idea of the temple on the lake. Excuse me, let's get a bit of water. This is the famous Badugu Lake, Chandi Kuning, which is now a tourist trap. But in the age of the Rajas, these South Indian traditions of the symbolic Mount Meru and the eternal ocean. So many of those South Indian temples and the ideas sweeping down to Java and Cambodia derive from that tradition, classical Hindu traditions. Trade had a lot to do with the way decorative garden traditions were adopted, adapted, absorbed. The Moorish tradition, that from the 9th, 10th century onwards, of course, the Indian traders started in the 4th century, and they were looking from Gujarat, they were looking for the famous sandalwood of East Indonesia. And they didn't have any metal implements, so they were bringing axes and things and trading for the sandalwood. They also bought the textile, the Gujarati double ikat textile. So all of that Indonesian textile is descended from the early Gujarati traders called ikat. And also the Moorish traders then started looking for spices, cinnamon and nutmeg from Banda, I mean, Christopher Columbus was looking for Banda Island, a tiny island. Little Banda was swapped between the Dutch and the English for Manhattan, which is a wonderful side story that relates to Southeast Asian garden history, because Banda was the center of world commerce, and it's just a speck in the Spice Islands. And for years, the Arab traders had dominated the spices, which they needed in Egypt and North Africa for their curries. And then, of course, it became necessary to cure the corned beef for the Napoleon's troops, for example, to fight on in later centuries. But this nutmeg was terribly important. So we had this Moorish influence in the gardens. This could be a sort of derivative of Alhambra. It's the palace of the king of Jogja. It's called the Taman Sari, the fragrant water palace. It's very special. And this is probably now under 10 inches of lahar, volcanic ash mixed with rainwater. It's a bit like Pompeii at the moment in poor old Yogyakarta, which is a city of 4 million people. Now, after this sort of era of the Chinese and the Arab traders and the Indians, the Indian pilgrim priests, you had quite a solid period of the age, what I call the age of the Rajas, and the decorative traditions became very sophisticated. So the Balinese were doing these sort of Chinese-inspired red brick from Majapahit from Java. Of course, the Hindu landscape and architectural traditions from Java, which was called the mother culture, the golden era of classic Javanese Hinduism, swept into Bali. The priests, many of the princes came to Bali, and this was one of the great works of the Raja of Lombok, the island next to Bali, called Taman Mayura. It's got a mind of its own, this remote. Of course, the colonial era too. And it was generally through the courts, the dissemination of Islam was through the courts. The dissemination of these sort of English landscape, Dutch, Shishi, statuary sort of traditions from which the country will never recover, were disseminated through the courts. This is the beautiful palace in Solo, very near Yogyakarta. But still, the mysticism of the Indian garden was maintained. There are exactly 81 choco trees because it was a very important Buddhist number. The culture of Indonesia is very much Shiva and Buddha, Shiva Buddhism, Hindu Buddhism. And in the colonial era, there were such beautiful gardens in Java. I'm tending to use my images from Java and Bali because I live there and because they are my best images. But it was very similar in Burma. And in Thailand, of course, was not colonized, but it adopted French traditions in their gardens. So there's more strange little bonsais and things happening in Thailand until recent times, until Bill Bensley got into the groove. But East Java really had these wonderful estates with incredible parklands. Now, the Rajas were not averse to doing, while the kings in the courts and their gardens in Europe were doing chinoiserie dining rooms, and they'd have little, Shanti has a Chinese dining room, but I'm thinking of the famous Japanese garden in Courance, Chateau Courance outside Paris, which is a La Notre garden, originally a Dutch water garden, because the Dutch apparently introduced the water gardens into France. But in the Rajas of Asia were doing these sort of European oiserie, formal gardens with arbors and statuary, and they're trying to, this was 1940s, but it looks like something from the 18th century. The Tirthaganga, the Ganges water in East Bali, the kings of East Bali and Lombok, but particularly adept at landscape design. And then came the war, the 50s and the 60s, the Hawaiian tradition, Belt Collins. Everyone used Belt Collins for all of those hotels in Penang. In Bali, this was the Bali Beach, a war reparation gift from the Japanese. I redid this garden in the 80s. But it was extremely popular, the Hawaiian tradition of the artful natural, which had come from the English, mixed with the idea of the sort of kon-tiki and the little bits of tiki-tak sort of culture, a little bit of cultural prostitution. And then the huge wave of kitsch. Somehow these colonial traditions had festered within the military, where they still have their home. You have these television programs in Indonesia where the choirs, the corps of singers of the ladies in their smart twin sets from the army corps groups come out singing from behind rows of tanks. They're incredibly kitsch. And this is in, you can see those pots and actually the cycads that we're using at the garden, at the entrance to the garden, which this is in Vietnam. This is in Saigon. It's funny, one of the volunteers came up to me this morning and says, "Hey, you must be Matty." And I went to the Nam, you know, man, we bombed the shit out of my son. I said, "Well, you've got to go back." He said, "Oh, I couldn't go back." He said, "It's unbelievably changed, and they're so nice to, because Australia was complicit in that travesty, and they don't hold anyone responsible. They've moved on. They're a wonderful example to the rest of the world about moving on. And they have some very beautiful hotels and gardens, and there was a particularly strong tradition in Hue of the emperors retiring at age 50 and spending the next 25 years building gardens, building their tomb. There are two amazing ones just outside Hue, which is north of Da Nang. Now, the rustic charm movement, I brought you through to the 60s there, but we'll return here to the 30s when a lot of artists took up residence in Bali and they wanted to be more Balinese than the Balinese. And the idea of the tropical idyll, I call it the rustic charm movement. This was Lumayo's house in Sanur. This was John Darling, an Australian poet, filmmaker, who did a very Balinese garden, and the idea of the shrine on the lake, which is very important to the Balinese and to Hinduism, always the water, and the yellow bamboo. This was Walter Follier, publisher, who married a great Balinese beauty, and he did this sort of rustic charm entrance to his house. Even in Singapore, this is the lifeguards did this at the one of the famous municipal baths. And it was that little idea of the little pagoda and the sort of, you know, ficus, and it's charming, absolutely charming romantic garden. I mean, earlier on someone used the word about passion, which is terribly important in decoration, but in artful natural gardens it must be poetic. And the sort of poetic element is there should be a story. And the story is often the idea of the monastery on the lake, on the water, even in miniature. We have to be careful to preserve that in our passion for artful natural gardens, which I feel here very much in Naples. This was the Von Buren garden. So everyone was sort of living native. We'd all gone native, and then I arrived, this was a mock-up I did for the Four Seasons. And the Four Seasons was 150 villas on the hill behind. You really can't see it at all. Today, the desired Bali hotel is like a series of microwave ovens with a concrete, you know, platform. But in the 80s, we were still sort of building things into nature. But the idea of the perfect garden is the combination between the natural and the man-made. And I sort of stormed the beaches in this recreation with those asthmat shields as from the Michael Rockefeller collection, the big sahib. And this was my house in Sanur. I lived here for 8 years, and I did this sort of museum of mud adobe architecture, the cross on the wall to keep away the demon spirits. And it's actually quite nice to see the lotus there. Hopefully we can get our lotus looking like that in Naples. And that was the first hotel I had designed, which was a mix between a palace, which is always dry, and then a water palace, which is a temple, the Hotel Saba. And that was the first ruinscape I did. It was the idea of the Majapahit garden. Majapahit was the last of the great East Javanese, of the great Javanese Hindu empires, and it was the red brick, as happened in Alexandria and other great empires. They always did things out of the red brick. And I just created in the Hyatt in Surabaya this little ruinscape, and then did another one. That was the first of the pots with the what falling over. I mean, it's an obvious thing to do, but that was a batik vat for dipping an indigo pot. So when you do batik, you have to dip the wax in the indigo, and they had these big pots. And that was very popular and has been much copied around the world, almost as much as the lamp from the Bali Hyatt. At that time, the Oberoys were doing gardens, and I had the pleasure of working with Peter Muller, one of the great architects. And I was, through my travels for architecture research and as a journalist, I used to visit a lot of courtyard gardens, and this was my sort of idea of an interesting courtyard garden. And the Naples garden I've done is a little bit like this in feel, that sort of poetic look. But ethnic was chic for a long while. There was a book out called Indonesian Ethnic. That was my house. So that was the chompong I have in front of my office in my house in Bali, and that's it sort of 10 years later. And even in very tight spaces, you can still create a sort of romantic, poetic garden. And it's got to be a combination of the interior design and the architecture and the landscape to really work. Now, then the poo hit the fan. And because the Indonesians had been watching all of us, sahibs, playing at being native, and they didn't want that at all. You know, I came from nature, I don't go back to nature. So they started, that was the Museum of Archaeology in Bali, which is a horrific sort of thing. But they became very grotesque. I call it going for Baroque. The blue chip in a tropical tourism world. And the idea, Tommy Suharto's idea, to build a statue higher than the Statue of Liberty. I mean, it was Balinese culture so bereft that it had to start gimmicks. There are more temples and houses in Bali. There's more, you know, you're neck deep in culture. Why would you have to start doing theme parks like that? The blue chip, this was it. It's an old quarry. I mean, what plant grows on top of a limestone column like that? It's sort of like plastic ivy at a dentist's. But this remains to the day the polite taste. This is Malaysia. I was asked to be a judge at the garden show, and there were like 50 gardens like this. Now, for the first hour, you're just horrified. You want to run a mile. And then you realize that they've all been done with love. They're all beautifully maintained. But they're masterpieces of kitsch. This was the Oberoi. Oberoi's a famous chain. Stop Vicky Oberoi. Revenge of the Barley Lamps. That was a Bill Bensley garden in Mauritius. But it's a bit, you know, this viral expression. Well, it started with the Barley Garden, really, that it really went viral around the equator. And Bensley was the biggest proponent of the sort of knockoff look. Too much is not enough. Less is more, and here's a sort of too much is not enough. But this is that this has been now associated with the Bali style, unfortunately. You saw a lot of images earlier of the real Bali style, but people now think that this, you know, you add a few temple umbrellas and you have all the pots and pans, and it's a shocker. Also, you know, the Imelda Marcos look was terribly and remains fashion. That's a dictator look. And this is the lovely little cute Vietnamese thing with the bonsai, what are they called? Topiary, the topiary deers and things. So you're between the kitsch and the killers, really, in the garden. So it was not surprisingly that people turned to minimalism. And I worked for many years with the top architect. I did about 20 of his houses, and then suddenly he realized that nature was old-fashioned and he didn't need a landscaper. That's what they all say now, we don't really need a landscaper. And this was his attempt, this pink granite pencil sharpener, with a lilac dwarf bougainvillea, you know, nature's sort of the most depressing plant. And all of these houses which were just loveless, treeless, birdless, clueless, godless environments. And they were certainly not children friendly, they were death traps. And they always had those stepping stones. This was the head of the Singapore Institute of Architects. This is one of the reasons I'm not asked to do gardens on the bay, by the way. And I designed the New Asia Zen Garden Kit. Because the Singapore Tourism Department invented this idea of New Asia. Because they were so terrified of old Asia. They were all very busy redesigning themselves as sort of Swiss people and things. And so you have the scatter border, and then you have stepping. You'll recognize it. You go to any hotel, in the expensive hotel, and you'll have to have all of that. And that was from Melrose, that, what's it called? Bush bulrush. It's a horsetail sort of plant, which was on the restaurant they did in Melrose in LA, it was a great design solution that hid the cars. But now you have it on every table, in every trendy sort of restaurant, in every garden. It's, you know, architectural planting, they call it. So the architects really have a lot. Even the great Arabella Lennox Boyd at the it's the Kew Garden Week, Chelsea Flower Show, when they give the great designers an opportunity to do these rooms. And in fact, we're at Naples, Brian Holly's great idea to invite some designers to do these large rooms. It's a tradition that they do at Chelsea when they ask people like Jamie Dury from Australia and the great Arabella Lennox-Boyd. But even she's fallen victim. Look at that border on that lovely sort of otherwise zen thing. She's got to have the racing stripes. I mean, what's it all about? There was a wonderful anecdote from this particular year when Jamie Dury had done this sort of outback, dingo barbecue sort of garden, and it was all out of like very expensive speedboat wooden paneling, and there are all these ideas, and caravan park textile curtains that were done in mosaics around an outdoor sitting area and under trees. And Prince Philip and the Queen, Prince Philip came around and he said, I think that's a dendrobium pinky. And Jamie Dury said, I'm afraid it's a dendrobium blues. I didn't come here for a lesson, he said. I didn't come here to be lectured, young man, he said. That got back to the Australian press. So I've just got a cavalcade of images here, I think you all know, but just to prove, taken from magazines and things over the years, how far this new Asia look, which is just a formulaic look, and it is the enemy of our beloved garden, club, botanical, artful, natural designer world. What's that one say? Authentic indulgence, the expressions, the mindless expressions they come up with. Yeah, that's what Bali's become now. It's just really horrible. Look at the Buddhas as lightning rods. That's an enlightened look. They've got little Buddha statues on the microwave ovens. That's the sort of North Korean embassy look that's very fashionable. Everything always repeats. That's why I was a bit fussy about those pots yesterday. Once I start seeing things that are equally spaced dark brown things, I get nervous. The setai in Miami is one of the new Asian sort of looks. That's our friend. That's another one. I mean, look, it's just grim, isn't it? Just grim. Look at it. These are the top designers. It's sort of like Letraset, the green Letraset, the garden. It's always one plumeria. That's all you're allowed. There's more one plumeria. They must have sold out in Letraset of plumerias, really. This is the New Delhi. The ballet in Bali, very one plumeria. And the simulated rice thing, that iris, that water irisy thing. There it is, Air France's ad for Bali when they relaunched their can you believe it? This is Bali. Extraordinary. I'll just have a break there. Can you put that light on, Larry? I want to read you something from yesterday's, while we pause on that very relevant image. Something from the New York Times Style magazine on Constance Spry. And I used to coach tennis. There's Hardy Amy's in that photograph with Constance Spry. I suppose a lot of you ladies would remember Hardy Amy's as the Queen's couturier. And apparently there's a bit of a scandal when Terence Conran, who founded the Design Museum in London, he didn't like Constance Spry's beautiful floral arrangements. And he was a bit of a sort of, what do they call an intellectual snob about it. He called it high society mimsiness, which is as in miserable plus flimsiness, and questioned its suitability for the institution, which is really being a horrible, horrible intellectual snob. And the limp-old question about the floral arts, major or minor, is still being asked, as it will be forever. But lost in the museum brawl was Spry's most important message, that flowers and gardens are an intrinsic necessary part of decoration, of home design, of environmental design. Many choked on the irony of Conran objecting to the exhibition, given that his retail colossus preaches her gospel, Constance Spry's gospel, and shares her goal of democratizing style. When you visit one of Conran's shops, wrote the poet and author James Fenton, and find some amusing table decoration, a nice little aquarium full of broad beans or whatever some zany and fetching assistant has thought up that day, all that derives from Constance Spry. It's a little bit like the spiel in The Devil Wears Prada. When that girl is being sort of intellectually snobbish about her choice of urban wear. This is the most famous architect's woha. It's just a tank trap, really. You couldn't have a child in an environment like this. This is Australia. All those beautiful, thank you, Larry, all those beautiful Victorian backyards of Sydney are being transformed into these yin-yang nightmares. There it is again, stepping stones, one plumeria. I rest my case. The Bulgari. Okay, so then there was 10 years of this, and I'm trying to lead a sort of rustic charm revival in my work, and I've been forced into India, which is really very difficult. And the same commandos who helped on your garden here have done this wonderful garden in Kovalam, a Taj Hotel. They've done 26 Taj Hotels. Of course, the Indians still love artful natural. They love the English garden tradition. And at Naples, that's a sort of rustic charm revival. That's the ruinscape. It's looking much more jungly now. Naples. That was just a Photoshop a few weeks ago. Even Bali, you're getting a little bit of a return to keeping humour in the landscape. This village guy has done his sort of garage for motorbikes. And that's genius use of palapa, isn't it? And I'm sure if the Mayans in Guatemala still were in charge, they'd be doing this sort of thing too. They'd rise to the occasion. Naples. This was the house that you kindly mentioned that was in the Architectural Digest for Bob Adams, who has a vineyard that was in that Sideways movie called Smoke Sea Cellars. He's Mr. Smoke Sea Cellars. And he gave me a free rein to do what I love the most, which is vernacular architecture. So there was a Bali and a Java and bits and pieces. This was a revival. It had been done by Skidmore Owings Merrill, who designed the lamps that are hanging in the garden with me. After we did the Hyatt together, I forget his name, but one of the architects, so Ken Vase, who now runs the Marimekko shop in San Francisco, but he was a principal designer. He wanted to stay on in Bali and design lamps, and it was a very mind thing too, so those lamps are a little bit SOM. And I went back there a few months ago and started to encase the whole white sort of Skidmore architectonic thing with red brick and lovely big slabs of granite. It looks rather good. It's a bit Franco's mausoleum at the moment, but it will get softer. There's some other lovely gardens around it. And in India, I've been reintroducing the Hindu garden traditions that the Indians took to Bali. I've been sending back to Hyderabad in particular, which has a desert climate. And the commandos built that because they couldn't get the right bricks. I mean, these are squillionaires who couldn't get the right bricks. This is it's opening on the 15th, the old palace of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was for many centuries the world's richest man. And this was an English palace that it was done by an Italian architect called Falak Numa, now a Taj Hotel. And this was the Chinese garden that I had to recreate in the last few years with the commandos. And that's what you see in the distance is the main gate of the palace. It's a vast thing. It's like Blenheim. And this was a Moorish garden that I did for the Reddies in Hyderabad, Naples. I think you can see that it does sit within that genre of the artful, natural, tropical Asian, and then romantic modern. Because a modern garden doesn't have to look so loveless. So I did the book Modern Tropical Garden Design to prove that, and I went to see the gardens of Jacques Wiers in Belgium. Because I really didn't like modern gardens, because generally you can always see the junction boxes and the water's all wrong, and the gardeners don't like maintaining them because they're just not arty. Gardeners tend to be quite feeling people. And I thought I'd do this book and then I'd get some work, No. The few remaining people who may have used my services were scared away forever from that book. But I continued. The Indians kept throwing work at me. This was a private house in Bangalore. In a modern garden, it has to be seamless, and you restrict the palette, and then you introduce some broad, brushstrokes of colour, but you still have to do it in a way that it ends up looking poetic. Yes, it's sparse, it's lean and mean, but it still is poetic. This was a big one I did for the Wellington Mews, the Taj Hotel behind the Taj. Very, very small budget, like minuscule budget. They were all... the one thing they do well in Bombay, the really only thing they do well, is waterproofing water tanks with smashed ceramic tiles, leftovers from building sites. And it's done by an underclass, and it's about $5 a metre, square yard, and they do it beautifully. It's called China Mosaic. So I had an Australian artist donate some graphic designs from his Christmas cards, and we blew it up on the photocopy machine. And you can't send it by email to India and ask them to print it, because even the mighty Taj Empire can't print anything. You've got to turn up with the roll, which they will lose the next day, so you bring 3 rolls. And it turned out very well. And what makes a garden modern is, of course, the artwork and the furniture and the lighting to an extent. But this was a very successful garden. This was the front door of the Bob David's house. I'm just showing these examples of tropical modern that is still romantic. This was the sculptor Pintor Siret. And this is a new Asian garden I've done at Naples, just to show that it can be colorful, it can be whimsical. This was at Novotel in Nusa Dua. That was one I did in Palo Alto for Elaine Tajima. Again, Gates by Pintor Siret, but it's still got that Asian feel. This was one I did in Bandung, still very, very new. Just trying to get a bit of shapeliness into it. It's got to have that, you know, the femininity. It's got to be seductive, a garden. That's a nasty Photoshop, but it is still a modern garden. And I showed the commandos that Leger painting. And I thought they'd do it, but they wouldn't. Exactly identical to the Leger came out. I could be sued by the Patrimoine de France. But they'd never heard, these Chinese gemologists had never heard of Leger, so I was safe in a way. And this is one of the lamps, and I just put this image as the last image because quite often you can get the flavor of a garden in just a little corner. And as much love has to go into a lamp and the base and the stonework and the armature and the planting around it, the Buddha belly, and those lovely little tufts of, what is that, Thomas? That little wild grass thing? That zoysia grassy thing? Yeah. I think it's a lovely combination, and it's brand new, it hasn't grown in and hid the neighbors. Buddha belly is truly a great friend. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Marty is willing to take a few questions if anybody has a question.
Don't say I told you, but don't look at the sign to the Asian garden today. Sorry, I've got a bad knee.
The question she had was that obviously he's got a great sense of humor, and she wanted to know whether or not any of that was integrated into our Asian garden at the Botanical Garden.
I think there's quite a bit of whimsy in the carvings of the Chandi ruin. I haven't looked. Usually the sculptors, they always manage to steal something a little bit rude in. No, it's not. There's not any great touch of whimsy, but it's got to lift the spirit. It's got to warm the heart. A great garden, and like humor, it doesn't always have to be a loud guffaw. It should put a smile on your face, and you walk around in a sense of enchantedness. You know, it happened to me the other day. I'm in this good mood because I came out of India like spewing spleen, and I went to the Dominil in Houston, the wonderful Dominil collection, and wow, to see Renzo Piano's, is lit up, and there were lots of wonderful touches in the creativity. But we are now working on creating a little amusing, whimsical thing in the tool shed off the vegetable garden, and we're starting to do things in the roof and sort of little sneaky things. It's important that a garden has that ongoing, that dynamic, that life.
Another question? Well, I have a question. Oh, do we have one over there?
Very specific, but I have had the opportunity to walk through. Okay. What is the beautiful wood? Sorry about that. What is the beautiful wood that's used for the Thai pavilion?
The boys contradicted me when they wrote it, but I assumed it was teak, but I think it's Bankarai. It's just a hardwood, a tropical hardwood. It is a lovely wood. It's stained to look like rosewood because the Thais like that rich red.
Any other questions? Yes.
How did your family feel about you changing your name?
Did you hear that?
Incredibly, my parents were very suburban, and they weren't devout Christians, but, you know, they didn't mind. The worst thing was my parents came to stay in Bali, and I was 20, and I was coaching tennis, and like everyone does in Bali, you sleep in a sort of whole pile of people, and legs and arms are going everywhere and everything, and my parents took a room in a beachside hotel for about a couple of months, and one morning I woke up and my father was rarely in a bad mood. He was a Pisces, and he was a very gentle man. He was a meteorologist, and he was in a foul mood for like 2 days. I said to Mum, what is it? And she said, well, how could you expect him to see his son in that mess of humanity, he said. But up to that point, they'd been very, very understanding of my theatrical nature, and they knew they couldn't rein me in, so they were great parents.
I had a question, and that was, what was your approach as you began the design on the garden here in Naples?
Well, we had a very good kickoff, and that we were friends, and the whole idea was to incorporate the wetlands. The theme was going to be the water, so that was easy to do a water sort of base theme in the Asian garden. I think, yeah, particularly Ray has, not so much with the Caribbean, but it was to be romantic. Everyone wanted arty gardens. We didn't want those new, modern-y sort of things too much. So we were like minds, thinking alike. There wasn't a big discussion about it. It all just sort of fell into place, really. Great project management, great project direction. It rarely happens. But it is a joy to work for botanical gardens because you're working with nature lovers who are knowledgeable.
Thank you. One last question. Well, I want to thank you so much for a delightful presentation, and I wanted everybody to know that we do have Marty's books on sale on that side. There's a number of different books that he has written, so please join us over there. And in the event, one of the books that if we sell out with one of the books, we do have book plates that he will be able to sign for you, and then you can order the book and we'll get that for you. So again, thank you so very much. Oh, and join us for refreshments or on that side. Thank you.